So please, Nelly, go on.
Okay. Okay. So, sorry, I forgot where I was. So our research in the PLUS project showed that the first step towards granting adequate social protection to platform workers is to recognize the right to employment and to labor union representation. However, in most European cities that we studied, accessing adequate social protection is a particularly complex issue, even when platform workers are granted the right to employment. On the one hand, self-employed platform workers experience precarity of income and uncertainty about future job prospects. And on the other hand, platform workers who enjoy employee status also face challenges. And here we found that in some of the European cities that we studied, new employment statuses have been introduced to address precarious labor relations, which rendered the distinction between employment and self-employment obsolete, and the ensuing access to social protections unclear. So we have the auto-entrepreneur status in France, the intermittent contracts in Italy, solo self-employment in Germany, and the trade status in Spain. Furthermore, even employed workers, they do not necessarily have standard employment contracts, and they do not have standard employment self-protection. So, for example, in France, Germany, and Portugal, employed as well as self-employed workers were recruited through subcontracting companies. And we have the Capacitaire in France, and in Germany, and in Portugal. So these construct lower middle class categories between employed workers and the self-employed, and the access to social protection depends on these specific statuses. So this means that even when platform workers are granted full employment status, platforms have devised strategies to exempt themselves from covering social protection costs through subcontracting or by taking advantage of sector-specific regulations. So the dividing line between the main employment statuses become blurred, and the introduction of new sector-specific arrangement, which makes platform workers with employee status very often to have less social protection than workers with the same status in other sectors. Occasionally, we might find also that other workers with the same status access social protection and benefit because their work and contributions are not stable and continuous. In most cases, platform workers are deprived of some fundamental aspects of social protection, and this includes coverage against accidents at work and occupational diseases. And in most cases, they are asked to cover them themselves. I have to repeat here that when we did the research, the proposal for the directive was not yet in place. So basically, the only way in which platform workers can deal with the combined pressures of income precarity and inadequate social protection is basically by working longer hours while constantly meeting platforms' unrealistic measures of performance. And the main interviews told us that this leads to overworking, exhaustion, and stress. And this, in return, contributes to problems that have to do with social protection, that mental and physical health problems. Now, again, something that's very common in the literature is that algorithm control is ubiquitous in platforms. Platform workers struggle with the lack of sufficient information and technical know-how. And there is lack of transparency and frequent changes in algorithms that increase a sense of insecurity. What we found is that very often platform workers are penalized with long periods of inactivity or even termination for platforms without warning or compensation. And this also has an impact on their social protection status. Now, a final finding is that platform workers are a really diverse group with different employment and social protection needs and expectations. And broadly speaking, we found that in terms of social protection, there are two groups: those whose income derives exclusively or mainly from platforms, and they're really dependent on them. And as a result, their lives are affected profoundly by fluctuations in earnings. And on the other hand, those whose income derives mainly from other sources and use platforms as an additional source of income. And there are many types of workers of these types, but what we found is that they are also at risk. So often you would have students who depend on this income, although they're students. So we shouldn't basically ignore the social protection issues of those people that are not working exclusively on platforms and do not have other statuses as well. And another important factor is that platforms are in the composition of platforms is intersectional, and platforms often adopt this type of intersectional discourse that promotes diversity and inclusion. But this basically concern clients only, and they allow gender-based and racial discrimination to continue, and the gender inequalities and race-based inequalities in workers' earning they are not something that they deal with. And there are also, what we found also is that there are questions of care that are often ignored by platforms, and also very often also by labor unions. And we found that what is interesting is that it's not only women who have care issues, but also men who have care issues. They often choose this type of work because it offers flexibility, but they often find themselves forced to overwork and lack flexibility. They realize that flexibility is an illusion, but this creates a lot of problems for work-life balance, which is an important aspect of social protection. Also, many platform workers are migrants, including asylum seekers, refugees, and immigrants, with or without residence permits. And here, this is a key issue that, especially with the new directive, should be addressed, because it has to do with the access to social protection of people who are often undocumented. They usually rent accounts informally. They have no means of getting residence permits and are more precarious than other platform workers. And this creates a lot of problems when actually employment statuses are introduced into the platforms. So it's very difficult to address this category that is often very significant. We cannot actually have statistical data on that, because if accounts are subletted, it's difficult to account for this type of worker. But in some cities, like in Barcelona, where we have seen what the introduction of the employment status does, we saw that migrant workers were excluded from this process precisely because they couldn't get the right papers to formally register with platforms as employed workers. So the European Commission's proposal for a directive specifies the criteria to determine whether a person is a worker and whether a platform is an employer. It ensures that the presumption of the employment status is effective and can be enforced and challenged. It also establishes rights for workers who are subject to algorithmic management in platform work, and demands platforms to declare work in the country where it is performed and provide national authorities with information on people working through them. Of course, these are very important steps, providing platform workers with the social protection that they deserve by fighting especially bogus self-employment, which is recognized as the main problem. However, in our research, we found that there are also other issues that need to be addressed. And we think that these are related to first of all, to the principle that social protection should be available to all, not just to people who are who have an employment status, but also to the self-employed. Second, that gender equality should be strengthened, and special attention should be paid to gender earnings gaps and work-life balance issues. Third, that equal opportunities should be genuinely promoted, and racist issues and gender-based issues and harassment and violence should be addressed by this directive. And finally, that social dialogue should be enriched, and this should ensure that representatives of workers are part of collective bargaining, and this is for all platforms, not just for the platforms where we already have examples of how this works. And furthermore, we believe that there should be more proactive measures on the part of the European Commission, which should be implemented at the national and at the local level. These include universal basic income that Andrea will talk about, platform cooperatives, digital welfare platform, and digital local currencies. So basically, I don't want to go on about this. I think Andreas will say more. I just want to say thank you for staying with us with all these difficulties that we face in this Zoom call. And I will give the floor to Andreas to speak more about these.
Thank you very much, Nelly. I would like to share my slides. I hope you can see well. First of all, I would like to thank PLUS Project because we are at the end of 3 years of research activities. And I think that these 3 years are quite full of a lot of things, and we got the opportunity to learn a lot by interacting together, even if the pandemic time was not the most useful to do that. But in any case, we succeeded in doing in creating some relationship. And then I would like to thank the research team of BEAN, in particular, Sandro Gobetti and Rachele Sarino that are here present, and Cristina Morini that unfortunately is not here because she's working at the moment. The topics I'm going to deal with, to talk about, is synergical with the speech by Nelly, and the title is ambition. Sorry, that is German. A little ambitious. How to fund local welfare, but that is, I think, that is an important topic. For there should be more in detail discussed inside the European Commission at policy level, because sometimes it's not so much considered as it should be. 2 key questions. The first one is to do with the taxation of digital platforms. That is a very big argument. The idea is a double. The first one is how to tax, and I don't want you have too many expectations from my speech. I give not an answer about that. There are some proposals. We had the opportunity to discuss them in our deliverable 3.3 about web tax, digital tax, and so on. Now we'll try to highlight the open question. The second point is if it's possible, by imagining the possibility to tax digital platform, to provide a return, a fiscal return for the local territories. Why local territories and local situation are quite important? Because metropolitan city and the 8 cities of our sample are very explicative in this way, are allow the exploitation of positive external economies for the big platform. Without metropolitan areas, this kind of digital platform cannot reach the right degrees of connectivity and to exploit dynamics, increasing return of scale in terms of learning and network dynamics from an economic point of view. And what is the paradox is that all this wealth that is created by this digital platform by exploiting local territories, nothing in terms of euros, dollars, or what you like, is returned to these territories. And that is a political problem, as you can understand. Of course, this point leads to the second one, because here there is a sort of big, and I can say black hole, a big hole in which it's possible to find all the liquidity of monetary liquidity in order to finance local welfare initiatives. About the first point, the open questions are the following. We need to imagine and to propose in empirical and applicable terms new form of taxation, because the digital platform represent a new form of accumulation and valorization in contemporary capitalisms. There is the two main problems are the following. Digital platforms are supranational platforms. It's difficult to organize a national taxation when you have to face a business that is by definition go over any kind of national borders. These platforms are over the national border. So every idea of a national taxation is overcome by the new models of production and labor organization of digital platform. That is an important challenge for Europe, because that implies that one of the points, a political point, that the European Commission should stress is to create a common fiscal policy. As you know, Europe is based on monetary common policy by the creation of euro, but that is just only a leg of the European Union, only a very part. And I think it's not the more important part. The more important part for the creation of a really economic, social, and political European Union is to work about the building of a fiscal, social, technological, industrial common policy. And this year we face a lack. We face some deficiencies about the construction of Europe. That is, I think that this research shows exactly this contradiction in political terms. The second point is about the new form of valorization, is that the digital platforms are able to create new form of value. We call in our deliverable value network. The centrality of the value network mechanism is not only based because platforms are able to provide varied services in terms of food delivery, hospitality, transport, and personal advice. The four platforms that was under analysis in our research project. But what is more important, I think, in terms of capitalization, in terms of profitability of this big platform, is that they are able to collect data in terms of use value. That is data that every one of us is able to provide because he or she has a necessity to be connected in order to have relationship, etc., etc. What is happening every day in our life. But this use value of the data, of the information, of the knowledge we are able to provide, this platform, that is the novelty of the new capitalistic valorization of nowadays, are transformed in exchange values, and transformed in profitability. This value is very difficult to measure. It's very difficult to measure. And I think that I'm not personally, we think that the only possibility to have a return, a redistribution of this value is to operate at a different values, a different level, and one of these is a fiscal level. And of course, there is a need of a coordination among states, starting from Europe, but Europe maybe that is not enough if we think at a global level. When we talk about the innovative local welfare, I don't want to stress about the 4 points that Nelly already is quoted in her intervention. That is the universal and conditional basic income as a very important tool for the new welfare condition in a situation in which we have to consider basic income a tool of remuneration, not only a tool of assistantship, as that is a heritage of Keynesian or worker welfare. We have to think a basic income, and that is why it must be unconditional, first of all, as a remuneration of our supply of data, of our capacity to be productive inputs inside the valorization process of platform capitalisms. We are part of the labor of the productive activity, even if mostly we are not remunerated for that. That is a idea of a new idea of that is why basic income should be unconditional, because of remuneration. You have already paid for that. You have done for that. You already worked for that, even if your work is not certified, and unconditional and universal, because every one of us is participating to this process. The second point is about, and I don't go in detail about that, is the rise of platform cooperatives. That is quite important. There is a part of this of Plus Research, the working package number 5, that is focused on these topics. And then the possibility to create a municipal platforms managed by the community. Can be the municipalities, can be the province, can be a self-organized form of community that is able to manage in a common way, because most of the social services provided by platform can be considered common goods, like care, like transport, like this kind of social services. And at last, and this is the last part of my intervention, I hope not to speak too much, is about, and that is something innovative, we can say, has to do with the possibility to experiment new form of local financing of this innovative welfare system. All these 4 arguments, all these 4 points should be experimented. Here, the sentence is a EU institution in collaboration with national and local governments should be created a possibility, operative and political task in order to experiment this kind of proposal, to see what is wrong and what is right, how it's possible to better, how it's possible to go on with a scale of experimentation. And that is the same about, that is maybe easier for this 4th point, that is about the building of, as you can see, digital local currency system. That is not only the only way to finance local welfare. Here, there is just a list. The first one is to build up a taxation, a tax reform able to get part of the revenues by digital framework and to redistribute at the local level. And that is what at the European level we are. There is a discussion about that. I forgot to say about this point that the general agreement about the introduction of a minimum corporate tax about digital platform that was decided in G20 in Rome at the end of last October and signed by more than 137 countries. And that is the first time that is possible, that there is an idea of a common global fiscal policy. What's the problem? What's the problem? The problem is that the fiscal tax is about 15%. And that is a very, very low level. The very low level because there is a sort of generalized tax discount. And because this effective rate of 50% is lower than the average rate still operating at the national level. So that is something that can create a sort of contradiction with the introduction of a web or digital tax. And that is another problem, just I want like to say, but of course we need more time to discuss it. And then it's possible, a second possibility to finance a local welfare is to use the traditional tool of monetary policy. One idea could be the possibility for big cities or metropolitan area to issue local bonds that can be bought directly on the secondary market by quantitative easing policies by the central bank, as the central bank does with the national bonds in Italy, Spain, Germany, French, and so on. No? There is a guarantee that these bonds are issued by at local level are bought and reserved by the central bank in order to avoid speculative dynamics. That is not new because in most big cities in Europe, even in Italy, I think at Torino and Bologna and Bolzano, for instance, as far as Italy is concerned, in the last year, issued some metropolitan bonds, in particular in terms of derivatives, with a lot of negative consequence because of speculation activity. And so it's important if we would like to think about this tool to avoid this kind of danger. And the third one is what just a couple of minutes more to experiment and to imagine a digital local currency as a new source of financing. What we mean with that? A local digital currency should recreate a different economic circuit. I do not dare to use the term alternative economic circuit, but that is what we could have in mind, some alternative, in which material and immaterial production is no longer financed by financial and credit market as usual. From this point of view, it deals with an imagination of a sort of community local financial institution we can call a bank of the commons or something like that, able to generate no property money under the community supervision in a democratic way, which is irreducible and irreconcilable to the traditional financial hierarchies. Now, the technology, the digital technology, is able to create money ex nihilo, coming from null, without cost. It's like a string that is able to be issued in a financial and monetary wallet of the people. The aim of this alternative financial circuit is to provide financing for the development of social services, production of use value, no profit organization, remunerating the social cooperation that is the condition to create wealth and profit for the digital platform. The production of human beings in favor of human beings outside exchange values can represent now and soon a beginning experiment of alternative way of living without depending on external financial constraints, since this kind of local currency are not constrained by any kind, till now, any kind of stability pacts. The idea is represented in this last slide, where there is a very rough description of this local digital currency circuit. There is the creation of local digital currency that is created in order not to consume, like most of the complementary currency, but is created to finance as credit money. That is completely different from the usual complementary currencies that are operating all over the world. The finance of social service, investment, use value, monetary wage, because you can use to pay labor activity, work activity, social cooperation, care activity, social reproduction services, that nowadays most of these services are not remunerated, in order to make a circuit in which the metropolitan area can create a second municipality balance in this currency that is able to use according to some goals in order to create the condition for the implementation of a better local welfare in terms of basic income, free access to public utility, housing, transport, what you like, and in this time, of course, health care systems at the territorial level as prevention for other big drama as COVID. At the same time, from the other side, this kind of currency can be used in order to remunerate positive urban externalities, social cooperation, consumption, by recognizing the learned and network economies that the social cooperation nowadays is able to provide, and that is the principal source of the new capitalism's valorization. And that is to create a sort of second mechanism of financing the local welfare, respect to the traditional one, depending on central financing, and to see if it's possible to create the condition for the development of this alternative circuit. That's all. I hope not to spend too much time.
Thank you, Andrea. Thank you. And I will leave the floor to Vina.
Maurilio, sorry, my computer just froze. Can you repeat yourself?
I was just giving you the floor.
Okay, great. And how much time do we have left, just so I don't go over?
We have 15 minutes, but because the workshop was supposed to end at 4:30, but we can take a bit more if we want to stay, as we had some problems.
Okay, I will try and be short so we don't keep people for longer than they intended. But I want to start just by saying thank you so much for having me. It's fascinating. I was very excited to read the reports that Maurilio sent me. I'm very honored to be here amongst all of you and to learn from you. And I hope one day that we can do this in person. But the only good part of the pandemic is that I've been able to meet people all over the world without moving from my home. So I'm grateful for that. I'm just going to give you some background on me and my own research so you understand how I'm thinking about this work in my response and discussion of the presentations. I started doing research on the platform economy when Uber started first in San Francisco in 2013. I started hearing from taxi drivers. My research was on taxi workers, and I started hearing from taxi drivers how these bandit tech cabs were cutting in front of them in the hotel lines. And then soon after that, the California regulatory agency created the first laws regulating what became known as digital ride-hail companies or transportation net companies me in the communities that I live in, one by one create new Uber type platform companies. And so my research has been both in the legal and regulatory response to this innovation. These dramatic shifts and how they have organized to elide the shifts to actually create some type of security in their lives. So I am very US focused, and so reading this was quite fascinating. In my own research, I find it important not just to foreground gender, but also to foreground race. And I saw some of this in Nellie's discussion. I'll note that in the US, and I think this is true in Europe as well, we can understand this sort of, especially the in-person platform economy, the in-person digital service economy, as a coercive racial project, as the continuation of sharecropping, peonage systems. Many of the people, the 70% of people who do in-person platform work in the US are people of color or immigrant workers, very similar to the European context, a lot of whom are undocumented, and sort of centering this in the regulatory response to these companies, I think is quite important. I have argued that the most important sort of part from the worker perspective of the innovation of these companies is really how they pay the workers, and not just that they're paying them digitally, but they have invented this new form of digital piecework so that it is not like the piecework of the early 20th century prior to the Industrial Revolution, but actually piecework that is completely unpredictable, and that the use of data and AI to shape behavior through piecework payments. So for example, and you've probably captured this in some of your own data, but I actually think this is central to understanding, a worker might be told that they'll get a bonus if they finish 30 rides or 30 deliveries. But then once they get closer to achieving those 30 rides or 30 deliveries, they stop getting work, or say they refuse work, and then the result is that they don't get deliveries for some time. And so, these companies are working with social psychologists essentially to exert control in these really new and troubling ways, which in the end means that workers have no control over their money, over their income, right? The income is more so than in other misclassified sectors. The income predictability here is almost nil. And the EC directive, the EC proposal addresses this to some degree, but I want to argue, and it was part of some of these discussions, that without the ABC test, which is a legal test to determine who the primary hiring entity is and who should get and how the minimum wage should be deployed, the companies are still able to engage in regulatory and legal arbitrage, as Nellie discussed, through these subcontracting companies, through franchises, et cetera. And so expanding social protections, as Andrea points out, is definitely the answer, but it doesn't address the precarity and the AI control and the information asymmetries that plague these workers. And so even if we do have UBI, even if we do have platform co-ops, even if we do raise taxes, the sort of data asymmetries are going to exist and create widespread inequality, even in the context of some base level of social protection. And I think that this remains a really central issue that we want to continue to draw attention to. So thinking through some of the solutions that I read about and heard about today, but particularly read about in the papers that were sent to me, the discussion of private platform cooperatives that Trevor Schultz and some of my colleagues here in the US have really deployed is an exciting conversation. However, what I think is more exciting is actually what Andrea talked about today, which is the municipal platform cooperative. And the reason that I say that is because the problem with private co-ops is that they fail to think about the digital infrastructural monopolies and immense infrastructural labor necessary to build and maintain platforms. This type of what is necessary to build and maintain platforms in the stage that we are today in technology is just simply not available to everyday people. And even if it does become available, or there are attempts to create sort of a digital platform that is sort of that engages in a cooperative model, the problem is maintenance. You know, there are very few companies, even most of them based in the US and China, who have the technological capability of constantly maintaining what is necessary to create companies like this, even in cooperative companies. The private co-op model also fails to, aside from the infrastructural problems, fails to really consider the political economy of monopolization in these sectors. So it is very hard. For example, in New York City, there's what's called the drivers co-op, which is a co-op of ride-hail drivers. They've gotten all kinds of seed funding to try and create and maintain a digital infrastructure. But the problem is that Uber and Lyft have a monopoly or duopoly in this context, that it is very hard for the driver's seat co-op to actually economically survive. And so this idea of a municipal platform managed by communities that is explicitly public and not private is really exciting. And I was excited to hear that articulation by Andrea. The other sort of discussion that Andrea had today, and that I also read about in the piece, was the question of UBI. And universal basic income is this very, very exciting prospect that many of us have been considering for a long time. It's also important to note that this is a solution that has come out of Silicon Valley more recently. And in that sense, it is one that we should be very careful in terms of how we think about it. So, for example, the Stockton program that was discussed in the report was also in part funded by the same companies who are engaging in regulatory and legal arbitrage that are creating these worlds of work. And so the question then becomes, why are they excited about UBI? The kinds of things that concern me about UBI are that in a perverted form, the kind of forms that some companies are pushing, in the US at least, it is really just a way to undermine both the possibilities for unionization in these economies, and also to undermine basic rights. So they say, look, we don't need to provide a time-based wage floor because instead we'll just provide UBI. But they are refusing, as Andrea points out, refusing to engage in the taxation schemes that are necessary to actually even fund the basics of a UBI. And I would encourage people to think about not just the Stockton example and the various examples around the US and these cities that are engaging in these experiments, but actually think about the more recently throughout the pandemic, for an entire year, we all received stimulus checks, about $2,000 a month of stimulus checks. And this, although it wasn't talked about as a UBI, was actually a very interesting experimentation in a uniform basic, a universal basic income. And what it did essentially was to increase labor market power. We saw widespread strikes, direct actions, an increase in an attempt to unionization. But what we are now seeing, unfortunately, is a rise in prices. And inflation can be attributed to many, many things, of course, as the macroeconomists will tell us. But employers and companies are explicitly raising prices in response to the reality that they know that the consumers have more buying power as a result of this stimulus check, which is in turn creating whole new cycles of inequality, which is something that we should think about. I loved Andrea's discussion of thinking through the sort of wealth generation that comes out of the AI models and the data that is collected on all of us and on workers, et cetera. More recently, I've been thinking through and writing about how, instead of just accepting sort of you know, in Shoshana Zuboff's terms, that we are all constantly going to be producing data and engaging in this sort of inadvertently engaging in this sort of surveillance capitalism, whether we might not take this collection of data as an inevitable. And so as opposed to sort of thinking about sharing the wealth generation around AI and data collection, that we might think about taking an abolitionist approach to data, and that this might actually solve for some of the problems around AI information asymmetries, around the reality that these companies hold monopolies over knowledge about mobility, consumer preference, et cetera, that an alternative approach, a more radical approach might just be to say, we are going to stop we're going to stop this as legalized activity, that in certain instances data should just not be collected. And this leads me to sort of my end comments, which is that central to the problem that you all have laid out here today so beautifully, and to the solutions that you have laid out, is the immense transnational power of these companies that today really outweigh the power of sovereign national governance. And so I think this also needs to be centered in thinking about these kinds of solutions, whether we're talking about digital currencies or UBI or greater taxation, that we really have to think about how do we expand state power in relationship to private power. And part of that is just the very basic tool of enforcement, which is where so much of the discussion has been on the platform economy, but so little action has taken place. And so I'll end by just saying that with a slew of questions. I love the idea of the Bank of the Commons creating an alternative financial circuit that is focused on care and not on consumption. I think that's so beautiful and powerful. And it leaves me with many questions. I think this actually might be a way to get at what I'm talking about in terms of the decrease in sovereign state power in relationship to these behemoth transnational tech corporations. But it leaves me with questions about how does this alternative financial circuit interact with fiat currency? We know, for example, that cryptocurrency as it currently exists, which is all about consumption, of course, is very much risks destabilizing international monetary markets, and also is sort of creating the same kinds of inequalities that already exist in the economy. And so how does this interact with fiat currency? Must this come through and with platform economies, or is this something that's more generalizable across the EU? What are the environmental impacts of an alternative digital currency? Must it be digital? And under what conditions and in what places could we actually experiment with this idea? So those are my many comments and questions that I've laid out for you, and I look forward to continuing the conversation.
Thank you, Vina. I don't know if the other participants want to add something, or we give the floor again to Andrea and Eleni for feedback. So please, if you have comments, that's the moment. So Andrea, Eleni, if you want to reply, yeah, maybe we can change the round and we start with Andrea and then Eleni. What do you say? Okay,
it's no problem for me. Now, first of all, I want to thank very much Vina for her comments. And I sign, we can go on discussing about these topics for a long time. And as you know, time is a real resource that is scarce. So unfortunately, we do not have enough time for everything. I'd like to stress about 3 points I sign. they are not in the same order you talk about. The first one, I think that your points about the risk, if I understood well, of from a macroeconomic point of view, that the implementation of a basic income, this increasing of purchasing power, that is of course related to a basic income introduction, can be reduced by an increase in the rate of inflation. That is a typical point that most of economists, they are not in favor of basic income says. My answer is that I do not think that in these times the strict relationship between increasing of monetary supply, that means more liquidity for families, necessarily is linked to the increase of prices. That was the monetary point of view, the traditional Chicago school monetary point of view, we can say. I think that the last 20 years experience showed that with a strong, expansive monetary policy, quantitative easing by Federal Reserve and by BCE, didn't add as a result an increase in the rate of inflation because of the lack of demand, internal demand or aggregate demand dynamics. That is one of the big points to explain the recession, especially in some countries. In some years in USA, maybe not now, but in Europe certainly, especially in Italy, my country, where there is not only a great resignation, but there is a great stagnation, we can say. No, and that is why there is enough space, enough room for the increasing of income before this increase could lead to an increasing rate of inflation. If there is a rate of inflation, as the situation nowadays shows, is a strong, unexpected increase in the cost of production. That is not related to a wage dynamics, but to other reasons like bottlenecks in the subcontractor lines, increase in the price of energy resources, and so on. And so I don't believe that there is a risk of inflation in about basic income. I think the opposite. I think that as Keynes said and wrote a lot of time, it's better a little bit of inflation than a deflation, and then the devalorization of production, even if we think in capitalistic terms. And basic income can help to go towards this kind of situation. Of course, this, nowadays, for instance, about the increase in the price of oil, of corn, of raw materials, it's more relevant, the speculation activities than real economy reasons. And here is a long debate about that. The role played by financial market and the role played by financial expectation is more relevant in the dynamic of price than the real economic variables, especially when we talk about labor cost or something like that. That is, I forgot to say that, of course, the UBI proposal should be linked to the introduction of a minimum wage. There are two sides of the same medal. One exists because there is the other. Otherwise, there is a process of substitution, and that is quite dangerous for the same economy, for the same macroeconomic strengths. You are completely right when you say that there is a big platform and low activity, in the sense to able to create the condition to organize platform workers, because of course platform capitalism is based on a high degree of diversification of activities. The individualization of labor relationship is one of the characteristic of the contemporary, of the present labor market. That is one of the effects of precarity condition, of course, when the possibility to intermediate labor conditions through a unionism is not so important as before, because collective bargaining is not able nowadays, when there is a high degree of precarity, to work in a good way. I think that if we want to increase the labor condition of digital worker and of platform worker like Deliveroo, Uber, and so on, independent on the professional condition and juridical condition in which they are, if they are employees, self-employment, collaborators, temporary workers, there is a lot of names to indicate this labor condition. I think that to intervene in welfare condition is a intermediate goal in order to increase the potentiality for a labor struggle. Welfare condition increase the degree of freedom of choice of the workers. The right is, we are no more in time when the mode order of trade unions, and unfortunately there are a lot of trade unions that think the same way today, is the right to work. They think that in this context, the right to choose the work is, and to be put in the condition to do that, is the possibility, among others, of course, because there is no only one solution, and UBI is not the only solution, no, but there is a possibility to increase the arbitrage, to better the arbitrage in the labor market, and to increase individual bargaining in order to create the condition for a new form of collective bargaining. Then the third point was about minimum wages, but I already talked about that, so I can stop here. Thank you very much,
Andrea. As Vina has to go in a few, I would leave the word to Nelly to reply to the comments, and and then to close the seminar.
Okay, thanks a lot, Vina, for your really valuable comments. I think that what you described as a coercive racial project, I think this is a really interesting way of putting it, and perhaps we should have looked more on the racism in platforms. I think that regarding European policies, it's amazing that although the European Pillar of Social Rights, which is the basic text that defines this issue, takes into account gender and intersectionality, and it considers them to be part of the European legal framework, yet this proposal does not consider them. And it is amazing because not only because the percentage of workers in platforms who are migrants is very high, but I think what is also important is to take into account the platformization of racialized and feminized sectors like domestic work. And the example of helping that we studied, unfortunately not in all cities, basically mostly in Berlin, is a very good example of how these issues are, because we tend to take for granted the example of more of platforms like Uber or Deliveroo. But here we have a clear case where access to social protection was never there. We have a sector where the issue of social protection was always an issue, and platformization has not disturbed anything. So I think that it's one more reason to actually think about those issues in the ways that you described. So thank you very much for this.
Thank you, Nelly. Thank you, Andrea. And thank you, Vina. So I would say that we can end here, and I thank you all for joining and participating, despite the inconvenience. And yeah, I hope we will have further possibilities in person this time to meet and to talk. So Vina, if you want to come to Europe for
Anytime. Invite me, I'm there.
okay, we will think about this. I promise we will try to work on this.
But you have to come.
Oh, I'm coming. Next year I'm going to be at Stanford finishing a book project on these issues. And so maybe once the book comes out, I can come and engage in a conversation with all of you again.
Great.
Would be great. Thank you very
Perfect.
much.
Thank you very
Perfect.
much.
Thank you.
It's been so lovely. Thank you so much for your good work.
Thank you all.
Thanks,
And
everybody.
Sandro, noi ci vediamo venerdì, vero?
Ci vediamo venerdì, sì.